The Thunder of War by Daniel Vaughn. The air reeked of blood and sweat. My hands trembled around the hilt of my sword, slick with a nervous sweat that refused to dry. The rising sun painted the horizon in hues of crimson and gold, as if the heavens themselves anticipated the carnage to come. The ground beneath my boots shuddered with the rhythm of the orc war drums, their deep, resonant booms pounding like a second heartbeat in my chest. "Hold the line!" Captain Dren's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, over the din of the approaching horde. His words were meant to steel us, but they felt like a challenge to the gods themselves. I could see them now, a black tide surging over the hills, orcs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Their twisted armor glinted in the sunlight, crude and brutal, adorned with bones and scraps of metal. They carried jagged weapons that seemed more suited for butchery than battle. I swallowed hard and glanced to my left, where Alric stood, his knuckles white as he gripped his spear. He caught my eye and forced a shaky grin. "Just like the drills," he said, though we both knew drills had never prepared us for this. The first arrow came like a whisper of death, hissing through the air before embedding itself in the dirt mere feet from my position. Then came the barrage. A dark cloud of arrows blotted out the sun for a moment, and all we could do was raise our shields and pray. The impact was deafening. I felt the jarring thuds as arrows struck my shield, some glancing off, others embedding themselves with terrifying force. One man down the line screamed, a sound that chilled my blood, more than the cold morning air ever could. As the humans braced themselves, they could see the orcs charging down the hills, their armored forms a blur of muscle and menace. Dust rose in thick clouds beneath the pounding of countless feet, and the clamor of guttural war cries rolled over the battlefield like an unholy tide. Each orc seemed a harbinger of death, their expressions twisted into snarls of bloodlust. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath their collective fury, and the soldiers could feel it in their bones, a cold, unshakable fear that this was not a battle, but a storm of annihilation. The orcs crashed into our line like a tidal wave against a fragile seawall. Their primal roars filled the air, drowning out the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. The first one I faced was massive, easily a head taller than me and twice as wide. Its tusked mouth twisted into a snarl as it brought its axe down in a brutal arc. I barely raised my shield in time. The force of the blow sent me staggering, my arms screaming in protest. Somehow, I managed to hold my ground. I thrust my sword forward, the blade finding a gap in the beast's crude armor. The orc roared, more in fury than pain, and swiped at me with its claws. Time became a blur of chaos. I fought like a cornered animal, driven by fear and instinct. Each moment was a struggle to survive, every step a battle to keep from being overwhelmed. Around me, men fell, their cries cut short as the orcs pressed their relentless attack. The line faltered. "Hold!" Captain Dren shouted, though his voice sounded distant, swallowed by the roar of battle. The first wave hit us like a storm, but the chaos soon splintered into individual struggles. I lost sight of Alric, of the captain, of everything but the orcs in front of me. My muscles burned, my lungs screamed for air, and still I fought. There was no room for thought, only action. Block, strike, survive. I found myself face to face with an orc foot soldier. It wasn't as towering as some of the others, but it was still a brute, its hunched frame rippling with muscle and aggression. Its armor was a patchwork of rusted plates, mismatched and stained with old blood. It gripped a crude sword that looked more like a jagged shard of iron than a proper weapon. The orc snarled, bearing yellowed tusks, and charged. My instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. I raised my shield, and the creature's blade crashed against it, the force jolting up my arm. I staggered but held firm, pushing the orc back with a desperate shove. Its yellow eyes gleamed with malice as it swung again, this time low and fast. I jumped back just in time, the blade slicing the air where my legs had been. Alric's sarcastic words rang in my head again. This wasn't like the drills. There was no pattern to its attacks, no predictable rhythm. Every movement was savage and wild, designed to kill. The orc lunged again, and this time I met its strike. My sword connected with its crude blade, the clang of steel on steel ringing in my ears. I gritted my teeth and pressed forward, sliding my blade down and twisting to lock its weapon. The orc snarled and shoved me back, breaking the lock. It was stronger, but I was faster. As it raised its weapon for a powerful overhead swing, I darted to the side, circling behind it. With a roar, I drove my sword into the gap between its chest plate and shoulder guard. The blade bit deep, and the orc howled in pain. I yanked the sword free as it swung wildly in retaliation, but I was already out of reach. For a moment, we circled each other, both of us breathing hard. I could see the rage in its eyes, but there was pain there too. It was injured now, and it knew it. The orc feinted left, then surged forward in a desperate charge. I braced myself and crouched low, raising my shield. At the last moment, I angled the shield and sidestepped, letting its momentum carry it past me. As it stumbled, I turned and struck. My sword arced down, slicing through the back of its exposed neck. The orc fell forward, collapsing into the dirt with a heavy thud. I stood there for a moment, staring down at the body. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged bursts. It was dead, but it didn't feel like a victory. I'd survived, nothing more. Around me, the battle raged on. There was no time to think, no time to rest. I tightened my grip on my sword and turned to face the next threat. In a brief lull, I looked up and saw the next wave cresting the hill. Twice as large, twice as fierce. My heart sank. We were outnumbered, outmatched, but there was no retreat, no surrender. Not here, not now. With a roar of defiance, I raised my sword and charged back into the fray. The second wave hit us harder than I thought possible. If the first wave was a hammer, this was an avalanche, an unrelenting mass of muscle, steel, and rage that swallowed our line whole. I was knocked off my feet as an orc barreled into me, its weight driving me into the dirt. My sword slipped from my hand and panic clawed at the edges of my mind. The beast raised its axe for the killing blow, but before it could strike, a spear pierced its chest. "Get up, soldier," a voice barked. It was Alric, blood streaking his face, his spear trembling in his grip. He yanked me to my feet before plunging the spear into another advancing orc. "Thanks," I gasped, retrieving my sword. "Don't thank me yet," he replied grimly. The orcs had broken through in several places, their bestial roars echoing as they surged into the gaps. Chaos erupted around me as the once solid line of soldiers dissolved into desperate clusters of resistance. To my right, I caught sight of an orc, barreling into a young soldier barely old enough to wield a blade. The boy raised his shield, but the orc's brutal axe cleaved through it like kindling, shattering the wood and tearing into his arm. His scream was short-lived as the orc finished him with a savage blow to the chest. Another soldier tried to intervene, thrusting his spear at the creature's exposed flank, but an axe from a second orc caught him in the side of the head. Blood sprayed as his lifeless body crumpled to the ground. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw an older warrior, one of the veterans who had trained us. He swung his sword with practiced precision, cutting down an orc with a sharp slash across its throat. But before he could take another step, a massive mace came crashing down on his shoulder, crushing armor and bone alike. He collapsed to his knees, gasping in pain, before the finishing blow silenced him. The sight was horrifying. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me mere moments ago were being cut down like wheat before a scythe. The orcs showed no mercy, their savage cries mixing with the screams of the dying. One of the creatures charged toward a pair of soldiers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. They tried to hold their ground, their spears shaking as they leveled them at the advancing beast. But the orc batted the weapons aside with its crude blade and slammed into them with its bulk. The two were sent sprawling to the ground. "We need more men," one of them cried, but his voice was drowned out by the din of the battle. The orc's jagged weapon rose and fell, cutting short his plea. Another soldier tried to flee, panic overtaking him, but an arrow caught him in the back. He stumbled and fell, his body twitching as blood pooled beneath him. Everywhere I turned, there was carnage. The line was no longer a line, it was a massacre. I found myself face to face with another orc, smaller than the first, but no less deadly. Its yellow eyes gleamed with malice as it swung a wickedly curved blade. I ducked, the weapon whistling over my head, and drove my sword upward. The blade bit deep, and the orc crumpled with a throaty snarl. But there was no time to celebrate. Another orc charged me, its mace raised high. I braced myself for the impact, but before it reached me, a deafening explosion rocked the battlefield. A deafening explosion shook the battlefield, and a wave of heat and dust rolled over us, throwing friend and foe alike to the ground. I coughed and scrambled to my feet, squinting through the haze to see what had caused it. The siege engines. At the crest of the hill behind us, our war machines loomed like sentinels of destruction. Massive trebuchets and catapults, their frames creaking under the strain, launched fiery projectiles into the heart of the orc horde. The first volley hit with devastating precision. Flaming boulders arced high into the sky, trailing black smoke before smashing into the enemy ranks. The impact was cataclysmic. Orcs were flung into the air like ragdolls, their bodies broken and aflame. A second barrage followed, this time striking deeper into the horde. Explosions of fire and stone tore through their formations, ripping apart groups of warriors in an instant. The smell of charred flesh and burning oil filled the air as the siege engines unleashed their wrath. One boulder struck the ground with such force that it split open, releasing a spray of fiery pitch that splattered across the battlefield. Orcs caught in the blast shrieked in agony, their armor and flesh consumed by flames. They flailed wildly, some crashing into their comrades and spreading the fire further. The smaller catapults hurled clay pots filled with burning oil, which shattered on impact and ignited everything in their path. The sticky flames clung to orcs' skin and armor, turning them into living torches. The unlucky few who survived the initial blast staggered blindly, their jarring screams piercing through the din of battle. Even the ground beneath them seemed to betray them, as shards of stone and splintered wood from the siege engine's payloads turned into deadly shrapnel. The once organized orc formations were reduced to panicked clusters, their ranks crumbling under the relentless assault. For the first time since the battle began, I saw hesitation in the orcs' movements. Their unrelenting charge faltered as they looked to the sky, dreading the next fiery onslaught. "Push forward," Captain Dren's voice cut through the smoke and chaos, sharp and commanding. "Drive them back." We rallied, forming a crude line as we advanced. The tide began to turn. But it wasn't without cost. Each step forward was paid for in blood. I saw comrades fall, their faces twisted in pain, their bodies trampled beneath the crush of battle. Just as it seemed victory might be within reach, a deep, guttural roar split the air. It wasn't like the orcs' usual war cries. This was something deeper, more primal. The ground trembled, and from the smoke emerged a towering figure, a warlord. It stood nearly twice the height of the other orcs, its black armor etched with runes that seemed to pulse with a sinister light. In its hands, it held a massive warhammer, its head glowing faintly as if it were alive. A thunderous chant erupted from their ranks, a rhythmic, demonic chorus that sent shivers down my spine. The words were indecipherable, their crude language a growling symphony of rage and bloodlust, but the intent was clear. They were calling to their warlord. The ground shook beneath their stamping feet, the rhythmic pounding like the beat of a massive war drum. Orcs raised their weapons high, the jagged blades and crude axes gleaming in the dim light. Some slammed their weapons against their shields, the clash of metal ringing out like a twisted echo of the warlord's roar. Others threw back their heads and howled, a savage sound that mingled with the chant, creating a cacophony of fury that reverberated across the battlefield. The atmosphere shifted, thick with an almost tangible energy. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the orc army surged forward with renewed ferocity, their howls rising in a deafening crescendo. It was as though the warlord's very presence had ignited something primal in them, a bloodthirsty fervor that nothing short of annihilation could quench. When he emerged from the smoke, towering above them, the orcs' chant swelled into a unified roar. It was a declaration, a promise of carnage, and a challenge to any who dared stand in their way. "Hold the line," Captain Dren bellowed, but his voice wavered. The warlord let out another roar and charged, its hammer smashing into our ranks with the force of a thunderbolt. Men were sent flying, their bodies broken like brittle twigs. I froze, fear rooting me to the spot. But Alric grabbed my shoulder, his eyes blazing with determination. "We take it down, together." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We weren't heroes, but in that moment, we had no choice but to fight like we were, the warlord. The battlefield stank of death and desperation, the copper tang of blood heavy in the air. My breath came in ragged gasps, the heat of battle burning in my chest. I tightened my grip on my blade, a jagged piece of black iron worn smooth by countless battles. Around me, my brothers roared, their voices blending into a thunderous roar that drowned out the cries of the fragile human line before us. We had carved through their ranks like a blade through soft flesh. The humans fought hard, harder than I'd expected, but they were brittle. Their shield wall, once a solid line of defiance, had splintered under our relentless assault. I'd taken the first blow with a snarl, my weapon slamming into a young soldier's shield and snapping his arm beneath it. His cries had been short-lived. A swift slash across his throat silenced him. From there, the killing had become a blur. I moved with brutal efficiency, each swing of my blade finding flesh, each step driving me deeper into the human ranks. They fought back with desperation, their faces pale and streaked with sweat, but it wasn't enough. A spear jabbed toward me, its tip scraping across my armor, but I swatted it aside and drove my blade into the man's chest. He gasped, eyes wide, before crumpling to the ground. To my left, one of my brothers had lifted a human clean off his feet, slamming him into the dirt with a feral roar. On my right, another hacked through a cluster of humans, their screams mingling with the clash of steel and the wet crunch of bones breaking. A veteran warrior, his armor dented and streaked with blood, stepped forward to face me. He fought with grim determination, his sword flashing in sharp, controlled arcs. He even nicked my arm, the cut shallow but enough to sting. I laughed at the effort, the sound guttural and mocking, and bore down on him with a flurry of strikes. He parried well, but not well enough. My blade smashed through his defense, carving deep into his side. He fell to his knees, clutching the wound, and I ended him with a heavy slash that split his helm. Around me, the tide of battle surged and swirled. The humans fell back, their cohesion shattered, their will breaking under our relentless advance. For every one of us that fell, 3 of them were cut down. But still, they fought. Some, despite their terror, stood their ground. A group of spearmen tried to rally, their weapons bristling toward us like the spines of a hedgehog. I charged them with a roar, my brothers close behind. Their formation broke as we crashed into them, our weapons smashing through shields and spears alike. The men scattered, and we cut them down as they fled. When human artillery joined the fray, the ground was slick with blood, the air thick with smoke, and the stink of death. Many of my brothers had fallen to their fire, their bodies burned or broken by human machines. Flaming boulders crashed into our ranks, splintering bones and flattening those caught in their path. The fiery projectiles exploded on impact, spraying molten pitch and shards of stone into the horde. I roared in defiance as another wave of destruction tore through us, the flames consuming a dozen warriors in front of me. Their dying screams cut through even the thunder of battle. Around me, orcs staggered and fell, their once relentless charge faltering. The humans, seeing our hesitation, rallied behind their infernal machines. Their lines reformed, battered but unbroken, and they began to push forward. Their war cries rang out, triumphant and sharp, rising above the clash of steel and the crackle of fire. I swung my blade with savage fury, cutting down a soldier who dared to come too close. But it wasn't enough. The humans were advancing now, pressing us back with grim determination. "Hold!" one of my brothers bellowed, his voice raw and desperate. But the line was breaking. Another flaming boulder smashed into our ranks, sending bodies flying and scattering those who remained. I growled in frustration, gripping my weapon tighter. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. We were orcs, the unstoppable tide. Yet now that tide was being forced to ebb, driven back by the unrelenting barrage and the humans' maddening resilience. The artillery continued its relentless assault, forcing us to give ground. I bared my tusks, my heart torn between the urge to fight and the grim reality pressing down on us. We were being pushed back, and then it came, a roar that shook the battlefield and silenced the world. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, a primal vibration that rippled through the air and made the ground tremble beneath our feet. The orcs froze mid-swing, their eyes widening, their bloodied weapons hanging in the air. Even the humans faltered, their cheers and shouts dying in their throats as they turned to the source of the sound. Through the smoke and chaos, he emerged, the warlord. He was a mountain of muscle and steel, his blackened armor etched with runes that pulsed with a sinister, blood-red light. Each step he took was thunderous, the earth seeming to bow beneath his weight. In his massive hands, he carried a warhammer so immense that it looked as though it could crush entire battalions with a single swing. Its head glowed faintly, as if imbued with the molten heart of a volcano. The orcs around him fell to one knee, bowing their heads in reverence, their dark chants rising in unison. It was a prayer and a promise, a declaration that their warlord had come to deliver judgment. "Gorkarash! Gorkarash!" they chanted, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. The name reverberated across the battlefield, echoing in the ears of every soldier who still stood. As he strode forward, the smoke parted before him, as if even the battlefield itself dared not stand in his way. His glowing eyes scanned the chaos, and wherever his gaze landed, the orcs rallied, their morale surging like a storm about to break. A human archer loosed an arrow, the shaft flying true toward the warlord's head. Without breaking stride, he raised a gauntleted hand and caught the arrow mid-air, snapping it like a twig. The sheer disdain in the motion sent a shiver through friend and foe alike. The humans, for all their courage, began to falter. Their shield wall wavered, men stepping back instinctively as the warlord advanced. He raised his warhammer high, its glowing head crackling with energy, and let out another roar, this one deeper, more resonant, like the sky itself, threatening to split open. The orcs surged forward with renewed vigor, their cries blending with the warlord's in a symphony of carnage. The battle had changed. It was no longer a struggle between two armies. It was a reckoning, and the warlord was its executioner. I couldn't help but grin, my tusks gleaming in the dim light. The humans had fought well. I'd give them that. They had pushed us harder than I'd expected, their pitiful machines raining fire and death down upon us. But they were fools to think they could stand against him. "The warlord will crush them," roared Gorak, the massive orc beside me. His face was smeared with human blood, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. I nodded, feeling the surge of pride and rage that came with the presence of our leader. The warlord was more than a warrior. He was a symbol, a battle standard, a living god among us. His charge was unstoppable, a force of nature that even the bravest of humans could not withstand. The humans' line faltered as he crashed into them. His hammer came down with the weight of a mountain, shattering shields and snapping spears like twigs. I watched as their captain, a grizzled man, barking orders to his men, was flung aside like a child's toy, his armor crumpling under the warlord's assault. The fear in the humans' eyes was intoxicating. They were breaking, their line collapsing under the sheer might of our warlord. But then something strange happened. Two of them broke rank and ran forward to challenge our warlord. I looked across the field, my bloodlust momentarily giving way to confusion. They were just foot soldiers, their armor dented and smeared with dirt and blood. One wielded a sword, the other a spear. They weren't special. No glowing runes or divine blessings marked them. And yet, they advanced. "Idiots," Gorak growled, his voice dripping with contempt. "They'll die like the rest." But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way they moved, the fire in their eyes. It wasn't the mindless courage of the desperate. It was determination. The warlord roared again, raising his hammer for another devastating blow. The ground cracked beneath his feet as he charged at the two humans, but they didn't flinch. The one with the spear, the wiry one, darted to the side, his movements quick and precise. He jabbed at the warlord's exposed flank, his spear striking with surprising force. The blow didn't pierce the armor, but it staggered him. I blinked in disbelief. The other human, the one with the sword, lunged forward. His blade flashed in the blood-soaked light, slicing through the air toward the warlord's neck. The warlord roared, twisting at the last second. The sword struck his shoulder, biting deep into the joint of his armor. Blood, dark and thick, spurted from the wound. "No," I growled, gripping my blade tighter. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The warlord was unstoppable. He was invincible. And yet these two humans... I took a step forward, ready to intervene. But Gorik grabbed my arm. "No," he said, his voice grim. "This is his fight." In Orc society, a fight was sacred. Once an Orc engaged an enemy in direct combat, no other Orc was permitted to interfere. To do so was a dishonor, a stain on their strength and the purity of the conflict. This was not merely tradition. It was a belief etched into the very core of their identity. Strength was everything, and a warrior's worth was proven in the crucible of single combat. To step in uninvited was to question the fighter's ability, to insult their honor, and to shame them before their kin. Yet there was more to this moment than tradition. The warlord was not just a leader. He was a symbol, the embodiment of their might. For him to fall with the aid of others would tarnish his legacy, and by extension, theirs. His strength, his skill, his dominance, all would be proven or broken in this battle. Among the ranks, there was no questioning the decision to stand aside. To intervene would bring shame upon the warlord's name and taint the glory of his triumph. But as the humans advanced, a sliver of unease rippled through the crowd. This was no ordinary fight, and the stakes were higher than any of them dared to admit. I clenched my teeth, my muscles taut with frustration as I watched the battle unfold. The humans were relentless, working together with a precision and bravery that defied all logic. They moved like a single entity, exploiting every weakness, every misstep. And so, we watched. The warlord's fight was his alone to win or lose. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I never thought I would on the battlefield. Doubt. Fallen hero. The warlord's roar ripped through the battlefield, a sound so primal it seemed to rattle my very bones. I tightened my grip on my sword, the knuckles white beneath the grime, and blood coating my hands. Beside me, Alric gripped his spear, his face a mask of determination, though I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. "Stay together," I said, my voice hoarse. "He's just flesh and blood, like the rest of them." But I wasn't sure if I believed it. The warlord strode toward us, each step a thunderclap that shook the ground beneath our feet. His armor glowed with eerie red runes, the patterns twisting and pulsing as if alive. In his hands, the massive warhammer gleamed, its head trailing faint wisps of dark energy that seemed to eat the light around it. He stopped a dozen paces away and let out another deafening roar, raising the hammer high. My instinct screamed to run, but there was no running, not here, not now. To my surprise, Alric stepped forward. "We're the ones who killed your champions," he shouted, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. He pointed his spear at the warlord, the tip trembling slightly. "Face us. Prove your strength." My heart leapt into my throat. Alric, what are you doing? I hissed, but he didn't look back. The warlord paused, his glowing eyes narrowing as he studied us. Then, with a determined growl, he lowered his warhammer slightly and spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, the orcish words guttural yet oddly clear. Two humans challenge Gorkarash. He spat the words like they were poison. You are ants beneath my hammer. Alric didn't flinch. Maybe, but we're the ants who'll bury you. The warlord bared his tusks in what could have been a grin or a snarl. So be it, he rumbled, lifting his warhammer again. Your deaths will honor the gods of war. I didn't think we'd make it this far. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to retreat from the towering beast before us. But there was no retreat, not for Alric, not for me. Alric stepped back beside me, his voice low but steady. Keep him distracted. We're faster, not stronger. Let's see if that's enough. The warlord charged, faster than we expected for something his size. The ground shook beneath his steps, and before I could react, the massive hammer came crashing down. I dove to the side, the impact sending a shower of dirt and debris into the air. Alric was already moving, his spear darting like a serpent's fang. We need to get him off balance, Alric shouted, circling to the left. I nodded, gripping my sword tighter, though my arms felt like lead. You have made your last mistake, the warlord bellowed, his voice mocking. He turned to me, raising the hammer again. I will grind your bones into dust. Alric darted forward, striking with his spear at the warlord's flank. The weapon glanced off the ruined armor, leaving only a faint scratch. The warlord turned with a snarl, swinging his hammer in a wide arc. You fight like insects, he roared. Come, show me your strength. Alric jabbed at him again, this time aiming for the exposed back of the warlord's knee. The blow hit its mark, and the warlord staggered slightly, but he recovered with terrifying speed. He lashed out with his hammer in a backhanded swing, forcing Alric to leap backward. The hammer's head smashed into a boulder, shattering it into a spray of jagged stone. I saw my opening and rushed in, my blade aimed at the gap in his shoulder armor. I struck true, sinking the sword deep. The warlord roared, his tusks bared in pain and twisted with surprising speed. His massive hand struck me across the chest, sending me sprawling. I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs. Stay with me, Alric called, his voice distant and muffled. I blinked, forcing myself to focus. Alric was still moving, still fighting, his spear probing and striking. He wasn't trying to kill the warlord, he was trying to keep him distracted. Pathetic, the warlord growled, looming over me. You think your tiny cuts will stop Gorkarash? He raised his hammer, preparing to crush me where I lay. Over here, Alric shouted, hurling his spear. The weapon sailed through the air, striking the warlord's shoulder. It didn't pierce his armor, but it was enough to make him hesitate. I rolled to my feet, clutching my sword. Blood trickled down my face, but I ignored it. We need to slow him down, I gasped. You think you can outlast me, human? The warlord snarled, his glowing eyes blazing. He stomped toward me, his hammer dragging furrows in the earth. Your bones will break long before my strength fades. Alric grabbed a discarded shield and charged, slamming it into the back of the warlord's knee with all his might. The warlord buckled, roaring in rage. Now, Alric shouted. With a roar of my own, I surged forward, dodging a desperate swing of the warhammer. With every ounce of strength I had left, I leapt, driving my blade into the base of his neck. The warlord froze, choking on a throaty snarl. "Impossible," he growled, his massive frame swaying as blood poured from the wound. "Two humans." Alric leapt clear, just as the warlord collapsed to his knees. The runes on his armor flickered and dimmed, and his warhammer fell, still in his grasp, striking the ground with a dull thud. Then, with a shuddering groan, the warlord collapsed to the ground, his massive frame shaking the earth. I collapsed to one knee, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. Alric stumbled over to me and collapsed beside me. We did it," he panted, a shaky grin breaking across his bloodied face. The battlefield was still chaotic, but the orcs were faltering. Their warlord, their symbol of power, was gone. I could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the fear. "They're breaking," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Alric nodded, struggling to his feet. "Then let's end this." Before Alric could even finish the words, a massive battle cry arose from the army at our backs. A renewed fervor spread through the ranks as every able man surged toward the orcish horde. The final victory. The warlord's fall left a void in the battlefield. A silence so profound it felt as if nature itself was mourning. His massive form lay crumpled amidst the carnage, the dark runes on his armor extinguished, their light fading into the blood-soaked ground. His hammer, once the instrument of our unrelenting wrath, was now just a lifeless hunk of steel. At first, it was faint, almost uncertain, but it grew, swelling into a roar that cut through the silence like a blade. They banged their shields, raised their weapons high, and called to one another with voices brimming with newfound hope. I could see it in their faces now, the fire in their eyes, the straightening of their backs. Where moments ago they had been on the brink of collapse, now they surged with a supernatural determination. The humans cheered. Their voices rose in unison, a sound that grated against my ears like nails on stone. They were bloodied, battered, and broken, but somehow they stood tall. Somehow they surged forward, their shields locked, their cries of victory deafening. My grip on my sword tightened. Beside me, Goric trembled, not with fear, but with a rage so consuming it seemed to shake his very core. "They dare to mock us," he snarled, his tusks bared. "They think this changes anything." "It changes everything," I muttered, though I didn't mean to say it aloud. The words hung in the air like a curse, drawing dark looks from my kin. I shook my head, forcing the creeping doubt away. This was not the time for hesitation. Goric stepped forward, his massive axe raised high. His voice thundered over the battlefield, a roar filled with both defiance and reverence. "Brothers, sisters, look upon our warlord. He goes now to the halls of the gods, where he will feast and fight for all eternity. Will we let him go alone?" The orcs around us stilled, their breathing heavy, their eyes wide with fury and grief. Goric's words kindled something within them, a fire that had been flickering since the warlord's fall. "No," came the answer, a growl that spread through the horde, like a storm, rolling across the sky. "Then let us honor him," Goric bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. "Let us honor the gods who watch us now, waiting to see how we face this moment. Let us give them a battle worthy of their gaze." A roar erupted from the horde, louder than any cry I had heard before. It was not the roar of victory, nor of vengeance. It was the roar of resolve, a final, feral defiance in the face of certain death. My own voice joined the chorus, my heart pounding as I raised my sword. Goric turned, his eyes blazing with a fire that mirrored my own. "With me!" he shouted, and then he charged. We followed. The humans braced as we thundered toward them, their shields locked, their spears bristling like the spines of some great beast. They knew we were coming, but they did not understand why. To them, we were beaten. To us, we were rising to meet our destiny. The clash was deafening. Our front ranks slammed into their shields, splintering wood and driving them back. I swung my blade, cleaving into the first human I saw, his cry of pain lost in the chaos. Around me, my brothers and sisters roared, their weapons biting deep into flesh and steel alike. But the humans did not break. Their line wavered, but it held. They pushed back with a ferocity that matched our own, their blades flashing in the bloodied light. For every one of them that fell, 2 more stepped forward, their determination unyielding. I fought like a beast, my sword an extension of my rage. I felt the bite of steel against my flesh, the hot sting of blood running down my arms, but I didn't falter. This was not about survival. This was about honor, about proving to the gods, to the warlord, and to ourselves that we were orcs, unbreakable, unstoppable, undying in spirit. Gorak fought beside me, his axe a whirlwind of death. He roared with every swing, his voice carrying above the din of battle. But even he could not stand forever. A spear pierced his side, then another. He stumbled, his massive frame swaying as blood poured from his wounds. "Go to the gods, brother," I said, my voice hoarse. He turned to me, a grin splitting his bloodied face. "I'll save you a seat," he growled before charging back into the fray, his axe rising for one last swing before he was swallowed by the tide of humans. The line collapsed. The humans pressed forward, their relentless advance grinding us down. I felt a blade pierce my shoulder, another slash across my thigh. My vision blurred, the sounds of battle fading into a dull roar. But I didn't stop. Even as my strength ebbed, even as my brothers and sisters fell around me, I kept fighting. Not for victory, not for survival, but for the warlord, for the gods, for the honor of our kind. When the end came, it was swift. A human blade drove deep into my chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. I fell to my knees, the taste of blood thick in my mouth. Around me, the battlefield was quieting, the last of my kin cut down or dying where they stood. I looked up, my vision dimming. The humans stood victorious, their banners fluttering above the carnage. But they did not cheer, they did not jeer. They stood in silence, their faces marked by both triumph and sorrow. I smiled, my bloodied tusks bared. They had won, but they would remember us. They would remember the fury of the orcs, the final charge that shook the earth, the defiance that burned even in the face of death. As darkness claimed me, I whispered a prayer to the gods. My voice carried on the wind. "We honored you, warlord. We honored you all." And then silence, echoes of honor. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the distant crackle of flames and the low moans of the dying. My sword hung limply at my side, its edge notched and dull, slick with blood. Orc blood. My hands were shaking, though whether from exhaustion or the memory of what I had just survived, I couldn't tell. "They didn't have to charge," Alric said, his voice low. He stood beside me, his spear planted in the ground for support. His armor was battered, his face streaked with blood and grime, but his eyes burned with a mix of awe and weariness. They knew they were beaten. They knew, and still. I nodded, staring out at the carnage. The orcs' final charge had been unlike anything I'd ever seen. They came at us, not as a broken, scattered horde, but as a tide of fury and pride their roars shaking the very air. They fought as though their gods were watching, as though their warlord's spirit had taken root in each of them. "They didn't stop," I murmured. My voice felt hollow, as though the words didn't belong to me. Even when we held, even when they were dying by the dozen, they kept coming. Alric let out a breath, shaking his head. It wasn't a battle at the end. It was a... He searched for the word. A ritual. They weren't fighting us. They were fighting for him, for something bigger. I followed his gaze to the massive form of the warlord, still lying where we'd felled him. His hammer glinted faintly in the fading light, surrounded by the bodies of his kin. Even in death, he radiated a kind of power, a weight that seemed to linger in the air. "Do you think they were afraid?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Alric looked at me, his brow furrowing. "Afraid? Maybe, but fear didn't stop them. They weren't like us, fighting because we had to. They fought because they chose to." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood. The orcs had thrown themselves at us with a ferocity that defied logic, knowing full well they couldn't win. It wasn't courage I'd seen in their eyes. It was something deeper, something primal. "They could have run," Alric continued, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Regret? Admiration? But they didn't. They could have saved themselves, lived to fight another day. But instead, they chose to die here, together. I looked down at the sword in my hand, at the blood that stained the blade. It felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of every life it had taken. I tightened my grip, but my fingers were weak, trembling. "They honored him," I said quietly, nodding toward the warlord's still form. "Even in death, they honored him." Alric was silent for a moment, then he sighed. "And us? Did we honor ours?" The question hung in the air between us. I thought of Captain Dren, his voice ringing out over the battlefield, commanding us to hold the line. I thought of the men and women who had stood beside me, their faces twisted with fear and determination. So many of them were gone now, their bodies lying among the orcs. "I don't know," I admitted. The words felt heavy, a truth I wasn't ready to face. "I don't know if this was honor. It feels hollow." Alric didn't reply immediately. He stared out at the field, his expression hardening. "Maybe it's not about honor," he said finally. "Maybe it's just about surviving." I nodded, though his words offered little comfort. The field was a graveyard now, a sea of broken bodies and shattered weapons. The banners of our army still stood, torn and bloodied, but upright. The orcs' charge had been the last act of the battle, a furious blaze that burned out as quickly as it began. But it was a blaze I wouldn't forget. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The orcs?" Alric shrugged, his gaze distant. "Not these ones, but others. Maybe. They're like us in some ways, aren't they? They fight because they believe in something. As long as they have that, they'll keep coming." I looked at him, trying to read the expression on his face. There was no triumph there, no joy in our victory, only exhaustion and a quiet sorrow that mirrored my own. "They'll remember this," Alric said softly, almost to himself. "They'll remember what they did here, and so will we." The sun was setting now, casting the battlefield in hues of gold and crimson. The air was heavy with the stench of blood and smoke, the cries of the wounded fading into the distance. I looked once more at the warlord, his immense form a dark silhouette against the dying light. "We'll remember," I repeated, though I wasn't sure if it was a promise or a burden. Alric placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, but not unkind. "Come on," he said, his voice steady. "There's nothing left for us here." I nodded and followed him, leaving the battlefield behind. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the image of the orcs' final charge. Their defiance, their unity, their refusal to kneel even in the face of death. Perhaps that was honor, or perhaps it was something else entirely. All I knew was that it would haunt me for the rest of my days.